Good evening, everyone, and welcome to History Hour Online. Tonight we have Dr. Leslie Potashner, who is a Sorrento resident and a member of our board. She is an alum of Drew University, and tonight she will enlighten us on the prisoner of war experience of our town's namesake, Captain Daniel Sullivan. His was a plight shared by tens of thousands of Americans during the Revolutionary War, including his brothers. And Leslie has a lot to share with us tonight. So welcome, Leslie. We're looking forward to the research you've done. I know it will be great.
Great, thanks for having me. Let me see if I can share my desktop here. And let's see. Oops. And play from the start. Hi, hello everybody. My name is Leslie Potashner and I live in Sorrento, and I study the history of refugees. The rights of refugees under international law stem directly from the rights of prisoners of war. The question in both cases is, what rights do you have outside of the protection of your government? I was very interested in Daniel Sullivan's experience as a prisoner of war during the Revolution. Since Daniel was in the militia, I thought this would be a simple story about the mistreatment of patriot prisoners by the British. Instead, it became a complex story that exemplified the founding fathers' struggle to forge a new nation based on liberty, as Abraham Lincoln described it at Gettysburg nearly a century later. Let me start by giving you some background on the development of international law and the rights of prisoners of war during the Revolution. The United States was founded during the Age of Enlightenment. This was an 18th century movement that emphasized individual liberty, science, knowledge, social progress, tolerance, and the separation of church and state. This period is also known as the Age of Reason. It is the foundational reasoning behind the Declaration of Independence. So, how did this apply to prisoners of war? Let me take you through some of the thinkers who influenced the development of international law and the laws of war. Three ideas create protections for prisoners of war. Hugo Grotius was a Dutch scholar and a diplomat who argued that war was between states, not civilians. He argued one must take care to prevent the death of innocent persons, even by accident. This was a new idea. States used to kill every subject in the enemy territory. That is how Attila the Hun got his reputation. He gave the conquered peoples two choices: unconditional surrender or death. Next, we have Emmer de Vatel. He was a Swiss jurist who established that civilians were not a part of war. He stated, "At present, war is carried on by the regular troops. The people, the peasants, the citizens take no part in it and generally have nothing to fear from the sword. Civilians were non-combatants." And then we have Jean-Jacques Rousseau. He was the son of French Huguenot refugees who fled to Geneva from France. Rousseau established that POWs were non-combatants. He said, "Since the purpose of war is to destroy the enemy's state, it is legitimate to kill the latter's defenders so long as they are carrying arms. But as soon as they lay them down and surrender, they cease to be enemies or agents of the enemy and again become mere men. It is no longer legitimate to take their lives." So we have these three ideas. One, that war is between states and not people. People would be crime. Civilians were non-combatants and not a part of war. And the third, that prisoners of war were non-combatants. The founding fathers' belief in these ideas was quickly challenged, beginning at the Battle of Bunker Hill. But first, let's look at the Sullivan family. John Sullivan and Marjorie Brown were Irish immigrants who arrived in 1723. John ran an academy in Berwick, Maine. He lived to age 105. His wife, Marjorie, lived to at least the age of 87. depending on which genealogist you're looking at. And they had 6 children. Their oldest was Benjamin. He served in the Royal Navy, but was lost at sea before the Revolution. Daniel, who we all know, settled on Waukeag Neck, now Sorrento, and he served as a captain in the militia. John Jr. was a congressman from New Hampshire before and after his service as a general in the Continental Army. He later became governor of New Hampshire. James Sullivan helped organize the York militia, but was a politician and a Superior Court judge during the Revolution. He later became governor of Massachusetts. A daughter, Mary, married Theophilus Hardy. He served in the New Hampshire militia. And the youngest, Ebenezer, was a captain in the Continental Army. All 3 sons who served, Daniel, John, and Ebenezer, were POWs at some point, but with very different experiences. Daniel first married Amy Paul and had a daughter, Sarah. Mother and daughter died about 1761 or 2. After that, he moved to New Bristol, an area that included Sullivan, Sorrento, and Hancock. He settled near Doan's Point in Sorrento. There he married Abigail Bean, the daughter of his neighbors, John and Hannah Bean. Family lore says Daniel and Abigail went to Fort Ponell in Stockton Springs by canoe to get married. Now, I had to map this out on one of my nautical charts because I had to know about this, because that's where the closest justice of the peace was. At a minimum, it's a 50-mile trip. If you go around Mount Desert the other direction, it's at least 60. But canoes can average 5 to 6 miles an hour, so it's possible to do a one-way trip in a day. Daniel and Abigail had 6 children: Rachel, James, Hannah, Mary, Lydia, and John, who died young. A lot of genealogists don't include him. When a genealogist uses the term died young, they usually meant within a few months of birth. 2 events solidified the Sullivan brothers' support for the patriot cause. The first was the Battle of Bunker Hill. 2,000 American troops faced 3,000 British troops. It was a costly win for the British, with over 1,000 casualties. More than 100 of those were officers, which was incredibly damaging to their officer corps. The Americans suffered about 450 casualties. 30 men were taken prisoner. Of those, 20 died. The death of 2/3 of the American prisoners of war caused outrage among the population and the American leaders. John immediately left Congress to join the Continental Army as a general at the siege of Boston. He stayed at John Adams' home, where his wife, Abigail, was living. The reason for so many deaths of the prisoners of war was that General Thomas Gage, the commander of British forces, refused to recognize the patriots as prisoners of war. Doing so could give the revolution legitimacy. France, Spain, and the Dutch Republic could use it to recognize the colonies as independent states. Gage accused the Americans of treating the British prisoners of war the way he was treating the Americans. Today we call that protection. I include a picture of Gage's wife, Margaret Kemble Gage, because before moving to Maine, I lived up the hill from her childhood home. Her father, Peter Kemble, was a staunch loyalist and the last president of the Provincial Council of New Jersey. He was allowed to remain in his home because he was an old friend of George Washington. And Washington decided to winter his troops on Kemble's land. Our local legend has it that Kemble punished Washington by supplying the troops with Jersey lightning, that's better known as Applejack, to keep them drunk and out of commission. But we have no proof that that story is true. Kemble's children were divided between the 2 sides of the revolution. And to this day, Margaret Kemble Gage is suspected of being a spy and providing information to the Patriots. I love this portrait of her because of her posture and her demeanor on her face. You don't see formal portraits of women with such a casual, laid-back position. After Bunker Hill, George III declared the colonists rebels. Legally, that means prisoners have no rights under international law. Congress warned that it would retaliate for the ill treatment of prisoners. John Adams urged caution. He was known for defending the British soldiers from the Boston Massacre and believed in the rule of law. Sullivan, who was staying at his house at the time, wanted him to take up revenge against the British troops, citing the treatment of Ethan Allen, who was then a prisoner in England. In a letter to Adams, Sullivan sarcastically wrote, "The prisoners taken in our privateers are sent to England for trial, and so is Colonel Allen. This is glorious encouragement for people to engage in our service when their prisoners are treated with so much humanity and respect, and the law of retaliation not put into force against them." He's asking Adams, why are we treating their prisoners well when they treat our prisoners terribly? He then went on to criticize Congress, saying, "Do the members of your respectable body think the enemy will throw their shot and shells with more force than at present? Do they think the fate of Charleston or Falmouth might have been worse, or the King's proclamation more severe, if we had openly declared war? Could they have treated our prisoners worse if we were in an open and avowed rebellion than they do now? Why then do we call ourselves free men and act the part of timid slaves?" John Sullivan was calling for all-out retaliation. I find it funny that he says the members of your respectable body when he just left Congress a few weeks earlier. George Washington was outraged by the number of dead prisoners from Bunker Hill and by Gage's threats against Ethan Allen. He was captured in the Battle of Canada. George threatened to institute lex talionis, the law of retaliation. This was a pre-Enlightenment way of thinking of warfare. Washington stated, "I shall regulate my conduct towards those gentlemen who are or may be in our possession, exactly by the rule you shall observe toward those now in your custody. If severity and hardship mark the line of your conduct, painful as it may be to me, your prisoners will feel its effects." Basically, an eye for an eye. He specifically threatened retaliation against British Lieutenant General Richard Prescott, who was captured in Montreal. Remember Prescott's name because he's going to pop up in the story again. The second inciting incident was the firebombing of Portland, Maine, then called Falmouth. Vice Admiral Samuel Graves, Commander-in-Chief of the Royal Navy's North American Squadron, ordered the Navy to take, burn, sink, and destroy all and every pirate or rebel, and to lay waste and destroy every town or place from whence pirates are fitted out. His plan was to burn every city east of Boston, from Marblehead to Machias. Captain Henry Mowat was given that task. Mowat was an experienced captain. Before the Revolution, he surveyed the coast from Boston to the St. Lawrence River. During the Revolution, he patrolled the coast for smugglers. Months before the burning of Falmouth, Captain Mowat was aiding a loyalist shipbuilder in that town and was taken prisoner by the Brunswick militia. He was released after a few days, following threats of bombing from his ship and at the urging of the town people. This is referred to as Thompson's War, for Samuel Thompson, the Brunswick militia leader. When they set out to burn down the cities east of Boston, due to weather and other military considerations, Falmouth was chosen for the firebombing attack, although Mowat's choice might have been a bit personal. Mowat arrived with 5 ships, the 16-gun Canso, the 20-gun Cat, the bomb sloop Spitfire, the 12-gun Halifax, and the supply ship Symmetry, which you can see at the bottom of the map down here. Everything within the dotted line, which is a little hard to see, so I'm going to highlight that, was burned to the ground, except for the area surrounded in green. The larger ships carried cannons, and while the bomb sloops and the bomb sloop Spitfire carried mortars. A cannon has a flat trajectory, while mortars are lobbed in a high arc. Because of that upward motion, the bomb sloops had to be very highly reinforced so that the hulls could take the recoil. They shot explosive shells, which were hollow, called bombs, or they shot carcasses, which were incendiary bombs. They had multiple holes in their castings through which flammable liquid could leak out. Whatever buildings the bombs or mortars didn't get were set fire by troops with torches. So the Sullivan brothers joined the revolution. Daniel joined the militia and was chosen captain of the 2nd Company of the 6th Lincoln Regiment. John left Congress to join Washington at the Siege of Boston. He was named a brigadier general in the Continental Army. His first assignment was to protect Portsmouth, New Hampshire, after the firebombing of Falmouth. On November 4th, 1775, James Sullivan was chosen as commander-in-chief of the York County Militia. He organized the militia, but he spent most of the war as a judge, beginning in 1776. He also helped write the law that created the Massachusetts Navy. Ebenezer Sullivan first became a captain in Colonel James Scammon's 30th Regiment of Foot of Militia Company. He went to Bunker Hill, but saw no action because they went to the wrong location. Scammon was a terrible leader and was court-martialed for dereliction of duty at Bunker Hill, but was acquitted. This was an 8-month regiment, meaning they only enlisted for 8 months. After that, Ebenezer joined the 15th Regiment of the Continental Army. As part of the Continental Army, Ebenezer Sullivan took part in the invasion of Canada. He was posted to the Cedars, an outpost 45 miles west of Montreal. The aim of the invasion of Canada was to seize the province of Quebec and to have its citizens join them in the revolution against Britain. It was not successful. At the Battle of the Cedars, 500 Continentals were taken prisoner. The parties agreed to exchange the 500 Continentals for 500 British troops. The Continentals were released, but 4 officers were held as hostages for the release of the British troops. Ebenezer volunteered to be one of the hostages. Congress refused to release the British prisoners due to rumors of mistreatment by the British, so Ebenezer remained a prisoner. The Continental Army was defeated in Canada by a combined force of British troops and First Nation allies. The presence of Indigenous warriors reinforced the false rumors of prisoners' mistreatment in the minds of Congress. To put psychological pressure on the prisoners, the British threatened to turn the hostages over to the native fighters, who believed that it was okay to kill prisoners of war because they saw them as warriors. It was respectful, that they did not kill non-combatants. Congress debated, but resolved not to release the British prisoners. They delivered their answers to the British, along with a copy of the Declaration of Independence on July 28, 1776. General Burgoyne met with the hostages and convinced them they had been abandoned. He offered to let Ebenezer write a letter to his brother, the general. Ebenezer's earnest pleadings were used as propaganda for the British, who had the letter published on both sides of the Atlantic. It was highly embarrassing for John. Damage done, the British sent Ebenezer to a New York prison ship in September of 1776. He was paroled in February of 1777, which was often the case with officers. Ebenezer could not fight or go home, nor was he given his pay while out on parole, and he was subject for recall for imprisonment by the British. He was financially ruined. He asked Congress for his back pay for his time as a prisoner, but they weren't interested in taking it up due to the letter he had written. Meanwhile, General John Sullivan was sent to Canada to aid the retreat. He then joined Washington's army in trying to defend New York from British attack. The British troops attacked Brooklyn from Staten Island. Let me just move my book here a little bit. So the British troops were in Staten Island. Washington placed his troops in Brooklyn. And then the British fleet showed up in New York Harbor. Oops, sorry. Go back a little bit. Washington was in retreat. The last line of defense was General John Sullivan and General Lord Sterling on the Brooklyn Heights. In this map, you can see Sterling's troops here on the heights and Sullivan's troops here. Washington is bringing his troops across the East River to Manhattan here. So he'll wind up here on the island of Manhattan. John Sullivan and Lord Sterling were both taken prisoner. Washington retreated up the island of Manhattan. The British tried to cut him off up in Westchester, which is up here, in the Battle of White Plains. They then chased Washington down through New Jersey. By coincidence, Lord Sterling lived about 4 miles from the Kemble plantation where Margaret Kemble Gage grew up, and his estate is now a county park. This painting depicts Lord Sterling's defense of Washington's rear as American troops escaped from Brooklyn to Manhattan, passing Brewer's Mill. This is the Maryland line under the command of Lord Sterling, holding off the British troops. You can see their redcoats here in the background. And I believe this is Lord Sterling on horseback here. This painting was done in 1858, 2 years before the Civil War. You will see many depictions of the Revolution painted just before the Civil War, including the famous Washington Crosses the Delaware by Emanuel Lutz. Artists were using the Revolution to warn people of losing democracy to the slave oligarchy. General Howe, the British commander-in-chief, offered to grant General Sullivan parole if he would take a letter to Congress in Philadelphia to feel out whether there was room for reconciliation. John Adams wrote to his wife Abigail about the remarkable day Sullivan's visit to Congress. Sullivan presented Howe's request for a meeting with Congress on September 2nd and 3rd, which was debated for another 3 days. A committee of Adams, Benjamin Franklin, and Edward Rutledge was appointed, even though Adams felt it was a ruse to place blame for the length of the war on the patriots. This is only 1776 still. Although the committee met with Howe had no authority to negotiate for peace, and nothing came of it. Sullivan was redeemed in exchange for the British General Richard Prescott, who was captured in the invasion of Canada and who Washington had threatened with retaliation. After his release, Sullivan joined Washington again in New Jersey, where he commanded Washington's right wing in the crossing of the Delaware. He took part in the battles of Trenton and Princeton and wintered in Morristown, New Jersey. Parliament reacted to Congress's refusal to release the British soldiers by passing the High Treason Act of 1777. The act suspended habeas corpus. It defined colonists as traitors, not criminals, placing them outside of the British legal system. It denied trial and parole. But it also barred prisoners from execution because only a court could impose that punishment. The British created a legal abyss where the prisoners were defined as neither criminals, who had rights under English law, nor prisoners of war, who had rights under international law. John Paul Jones, the father of the American Navy, reacted to the act saying, "Our cruel enemies are enforcing an act of their parliament by the indiscriminate confinement of our subjects in English dungeons and not as prisoners of war." So the Americans were fighting a battle for international law as well as a military war. Congress voted to end prisoner exchanges. One reason was in reaction to the High Treason Act, but it was also because when they did exchanges, healthy British troops who could go back to the line were being exchanged for emaciated American prisoners who would never be able to fight again. One prisoner wrote this in his memoir. "I found myself in a loathsome prison among a collection of the most wretched and disgusting-looking objects, ghastly with inhaling an impure atmosphere, exposed to contagion, and surrounded with the horrors of sickness and death. Here, thought I, must I linger out the morning of my life in tedious days and sleepless nights, enduring a weary and degrading captivity until death shall put an end to my suffering, and no friend will know my departure." Ebenezer's, this was written about the first prison ship, by the way. Ebenezer's parole was revoked the same day Congress ended exchanges, and he spent another 5 months in custody. Back in Maine, the British tried to establish a foothold on the coast at Castine, which I think our first lecture this year talked about, creating the colony of New Ireland and building Fort George. In response, the Massachusetts legislature sent its navy of 44 ships and 1,200 men to retake the area. Paul Revere was in charge of the artillery. The British, with only 3 ships that you can see on the map over here, and 1 regiment, held off these 44 ships on the lower left-hand corner for 3 weeks. And you can see the fort over here. The 3 British sloops, the Albany, the North, and the Nautilus, are here. So they retreated upriver, and the American fleet gave chase. First, the British sloops retreated behind the island, and then up the Penobscot River, drawing in the American fleet. The British fleet arrived directly behind them, cutting off any escape and trapping them in the Penobscot River. They destroyed the entire Massachusetts fleet. Daniel's militia marched to Castine to fight, but arrived very late. This painting was done shortly after the battle. In the foreground are the British ships. In the distance, you can see the smoke and flames of the American fleet. The British suffered 25 killed, 34 wounded, and 26 taken prisoner. The American casualties were about 100 killed and wounded in the initial assault on the fort, but the retreat was chaotic, and the final casualty count was 474 killed, wounded, captured, or missing. This was the worst naval loss in American history until Pearl Harbor. While Ebenezer was on parole and Daniel was marching to the Penobscot expedition, John was given a task by George Washington. Loyalists and Iroquois had been skirmishing with patriots in the Wyoming Valley of Pennsylvania, the namesake of the state of Wyoming. White settlements in Iroquois territory were being burned. A false rumor spread that hundreds of women and children were massacred. As I said before, the natives did not believe in killing non-combatants. Washington decided to retaliate. In his orders to John, Washington wrote, "The immediate objects are the total destruction and devastation of their settlements and the capture of as many prisoners of every age and sex as possible. It will be essential to ruin their crops now in the ground and prevent their planting more." Most of the 6 nations of the Iroquois Confederacy, now known as the Haudenosaunee, tried to remain neutral during the Revolution, but the Sullivan expedition forced them to take sides. Notice in this depiction above that these were full-fledged towns. These weren't teepees or longhouses. These were villages. Sullivan, by his own account, burned 40 villages, destroyed hundreds of thousands of bushels of corn and other food, destroyed whole orchards with thousands of trees, and burned huge swaths of planted fields. 5,000 native refugees fled to Canada. This event is important for understanding the limits of Enlightenment thinking for the Founding Fathers. Today, these actions are recognized as genocide. Washington did not recognize the 6 nations under the rules of war of the Enlightenment. They were labeled savages and outside of humanity. They were placed outside the law in the same way Britain was placing the patriots outside of the law. As for native treatments of prisoners of war, non-combatants were used for labor and eventually assimilated into the tribe to replace the population lost to war. Native nations were built on inclusion, whereas European nations were built on exclusivity. At this time, native society was actually much more democratic than European society. In fact, American democracy was greatly influenced by the governing system of the Iroquois Confederacy, known as the Great Law of Peace, which was based on consensus, representation, and checks and balances. This 1929 stamp featuring John Sullivan commemorates the 150th anniversary of the Sullivan expedition. Sullivan took ill during the campaign and never really recovered. Afterwards, he resigned his commission. Within the year, New Hampshire sent John back to Congress in Philadelphia. In 1781, the British on the HMS Allegiance came to Frenchman's Bay to arrest the militia leaders. This is a picture I took from the spot where John Sullivan's house stood in Sorrento. In the distance, you can see the Porcupine Islands. Historians believe the Allegiance anchored around here because from this location, you can see both the town of Eden, which is now Bar Harbor, and Waukeag Neck. The British first went to Eden and arrested Captain Ezra Young, who had a farm just north of the town. We learn a very interesting fact from one of the ship's logs. Ezra Young, under threats and torture, told the British that Daniel was General Sullivan's brother, and that Colonel John Allen, the superintendent of the Eastern Indians and the head of the infantry, was at his house. When they came for Daniel, Allen had already left. They burned Daniel and his father-in-law's houses to the ground, leaving his wife, children, and elderly in-laws to fend for themselves in winter. There is a story that Daniel offered one of his young daughters in exchange for his freedom, but it comes from a single British sergeant. Considering the landing party had quite a few officers with them, I don't know. I don't put much stock in a story like that. Ezra Young took an oath of allegiance to the king and was released, and he lived a long and prosperous life as one of the town leaders of Eden. Daniel's daughter, Rachel, is recorded of saying of her father, "He was a great thorn to the Tories at that time. He frequently disarmed them. This so exasperated them that they complained to the British commander at Bagaduce. He accordingly dispatched a British sloop of war to our bay under the command of Mowat of detested memory. This is the same Captain Mowat who firebombed Falmouth and who had been taken prisoner by the Brunswick militia in Thompson's War." But for me, I really wondered, they sent a warship down to pick up some militia captains. Was that enough to make a special trip to arrest Daniel? They didn't know that Colonel Allen was there. They didn't know that General Sullivan was his brother. So why make this trip? A number of historians theorize that the arrest of Daniel Sullivan was in retaliation for the execution of Major John Andre, which happened only months earlier. Andre was the head of Britain's intelligence operations during the Revolution. He negotiated with Benedict Arnold to betray West Point to the British. With the control of West Point, the British could control the Hudson River and cut off New England from the rest of the colonies. Andre was captured by the New York militia. At first, Andre tried to claim he was a prisoner of war and not a spy. Under international law, even to this day, spies do not receive the protection of prisoners of war because they do not wear a uniform and engage in what we call perfidy or deceit. Wearing civilian clothes risks civilian lives under Enlightenment philosophy. So if you cannot tell who the players are, you can start killing civilians. Spies can be executed, but prisoners of war cannot under international law. Britain tried to exchange Andre, but George Washington would only accept Benedict Arnold in exchange. The British refused, and Andre was executed on October 2nd, 1780. I include this picture because this is a self-portrait that Major Andre did the night before his execution. Daniel was first shipped to a prison in Halifax and then sent to the Jersey, a prison ship in New York Harbor. In October of 1776, the first prison ship was anchored in Wallabout Bay, an inlet in Brooklyn where the East River meets New York Harbor. In 1777, two more ships arrived, but one caught fire while the prisoners were aboard. In 1778, the Good Hope, the Scorpion, and the Prince of Wales, and the Jersey were anchored. Eventually, there were 16 ships in all. These were all decommissioned warships. The Jersey was called a floating hell. It was the worst. It had been a 64-gun ship. Her portholes were sealed and replaced with 20-inch holes, 10 feet apart, covered with iron bars to let air in. The men were fed moldy food, not given winter clothing. Many died of exposure and starvation. Men suffered from dysentery, smallpox, and yellow fever. The filth of 1,200 men was dumped overboard daily. They were awoken each morning with cries of, "Rebels, bring out your dead." They would average 5 or 6 a night. The prisoners were called walking skeletons. James Sullivan, working as a judge, tried to negotiate his brother's release. In addition to American prisoners falling into a legal abyss, there were other problems. First, each side was supposed to support its own prisoners. The Continental Congress was printing its own money, which the British refused to accept for support of the American prisoners. The second problem was that the Provost Marshal of Prisoners, William Cunningham, and the British commissaries were corrupt and embezzled the funds, sold the supplies sent, and replaced them with stale and rotten food. The Provost Marshal only allowed them cooking fires every 3 days and none for heat in the winter. The conditions were described as thus: bad provisions, bad water, and scant rations were dealt to the prisoners. No medical men attended the sick. Disease reigned unrelieved, and hundreds died from pestilence or were starved on board this floating prison. Indeed, the sand beach between a ravine of the hill and Mr. Remsen's dock became filled with graves in the course of 2 months. Remsen's was the estate that was on Wallabout Bay. So this was written about the first ship, the Whitby, in 1776. Prisoner memoirs are filled with atrocities, recalling 6 men dying each day on each ship. 11,000 prisoners died on the Jersey alone. The British dumped the dead bodies ashore. After the Revolution, as the area was developed, complaints arose when the bones became exposed along the shoreline. In 1800, the federal government bought the land around Wallabout Bay for the Brooklyn Navy Yard. Workers collected the bones in boxes for reinterment, a process that reminds me of the workers at World Trade Center after 9/11. 3 crypts were built, one in 1803, one in 1873, and the current one that was built in 1908 and designed by the famous architectural firm McKim, Mead, and White. The remains were interred with full military honors. 230,000 Americans fought in the Revolution. Of the 25,000 captured men, 18,000 died while imprisoned. 60% of prisoners died during the war. By comparison, at the notorious Andersonville prison camp in the Civil War, only 43% of those prisoners died. The British policy was intended to deter Americans from joining the cause. People in England protested the conditions on the prison ship. One man spoke out in Parliament. The Earl of Abington in the House of Peers stated, "My lords, humanity has ever been the characteristic of Englishmen. But instead of humanity, our national character is now stamped with inhumanity. And what is worse, we have the damning proofs before our eyes. I have made this motion not only from the feeling of humanity, but from motives of policy. Your lordships will remember that there is such a thing as the law of retaliation. While you are making prisoners of the Americans by 50s and hundreds, they are making prisoners of you by whole armies. The fate of General Burgoyne is known, and if General Howe does not again shift his position, his fate will be the same." At this point, Burgoyne had lost at Saratoga, surrendering his army of about 6,000 men. They became prisoners of war, while Burgoyne returned to England. The British told him, "Go back to America and negotiate terms for your men's release." When he refused, he was gazetted out of the army. Daniel was on the prison ship for many months. An old neighbor of John's, named Stephen Holland, intervened with an offer of parole if he would take a letter to his brother. Holland was a loyalist who joined the British Army, and his property in New Hampshire had been confiscated. He also hoped John could get him his property back. Daniel arrived in Philadelphia on May 6, 1781, with the letter. Holland hoped that Sullivan would be open to negotiating a reconciliation in secret. Upon reading it, John burned the letter in front of Daniel. He told Daniel to reply to Holland that it had been received with the deepest scorn. After the issue of Benedict Arnold's betrayal, secret negotiations were never to go on again. John decided eventually to write a letter to Holland, but the night before Daniel left, he took the letter back from Daniel and destroyed it, and Daniel returned to New York and to prison. Stephen Holland wrote an account of the meeting and forced Daniel to sign it, so we don't know how accurate it is, but we can compare it to another account. John had confided in a French minister who also reported on the meeting from John's point of view. It's not really clear how much longer Daniel remained on the prison ship. One historian places it as late as June of 1783, which is only 3 months before the end of the war. But most agree that he was on the prison ship for at least 14 months in total. Daniel was finally released, but he died on the ship returning home to Maine, somewhere on the Long Island shore and not far from New York City. He was buried in an unmarked grave on the shore. Daniel's family claimed that he died of poisoning. Now, this story might sound like maybe a family's grief, but it was long rumored that the provost marshal had been poisoning prisoners. So it's not unlikely. I mean, it's not out of the realm of possible. Also, they said he died very close to New York, and it's just up the East River. It's a tidal river. You can go up that river very quickly up to the Long Island Sound. So if he was poisoned, it's a very fits the timeline. The town of Sullivan renamed itself in his honor in 1789. One historian claimed the town was named for his brother James. I find no credibility to that story, because James was a lawyer, and he didn't become the attorney general until 1790, and he didn't become governor until 1807, which, why name your town after a lawyer? A monument to Daniel's life was erected at the Sorrento Cemetery. The first one broke in half, and then the second one that's there now was replaced by his great-grandson. There is one story I would like to leave you with concerning Washington's last threat of retaliation, because if Daniel was murdered, it could have been related to this case. While the war was winding down in most of the country, Loyalist militias in New York and patriot militias in New Jersey were still fighting a very violent war. On April 12th of 1782, a Loyalist militia under William Franklin, the last royal governor of New Jersey and Benjamin Franklin's son, broke Patriot militia captain Joshua Huddy out of a New York prison and hanged him for murder. The first problem was that Huddy was in prison in New York when the death occurred, so he could not have been the killer. The second problem was that the High Treason Act didn't allow for the execution of the rebels. Washington saw this as an outrageous act of retaliation, and so he chose to retaliate. He chose a group of captured British officers to draw straws to determine which one would be executed in retaliation for Huddy's death. A 19-year-old captain, Charles Asgill, was selected. Washington delayed the execution if the British would turn over the perpetrators of the hanging for trial. Suddenly, the British cited international law and said they would try their own soldiers, which is how it still works today. Soldiers are tried by their own countries. The perpetrators were acquitted, but by then, international pressure was mounting on Washington. Rather than demand them to be turned over, he was under a lot of pressure, and by George III by Louis XVI, and Marie Antoinette got involved. As Captain Asgill's mother was quite a social butterfly. I don't have this in my notes, but they literally wrote plays about Captain Asgill during the Revolution. He became a kind of a celebrity. And Washington relented and released Asgill on November 7th, 1782. If Sullivan had been in prison for 14 months, he would have died 2 to 3 months after Huddy, but 6 months before Asgill was released. It made me wonder if Daniel was killed in retaliation for Asgill's pending execution. Tensions were very high in occupied New York. I'm still left with a number of questions after all this research. The first was, why did Ebenezer receive parole, but Daniel did not? Both were captains, and officers usually receive parole. Was it a question of being a continental soldier versus being in the militia? I'm not sure. The second is, was Daniel doomed by lex talionis, the law of retaliation, for Colonel Andre and for Captain Asgill, 2 international incidents? And the third is, was a frontier militiaman's fate decided by the greater issues of the war and the dissolution of international law? I want to thank you so much for coming and listening to this story. And I guess if you have any questions, I'm open to.
Thank you, Leslie, for delving deep into that history. It's kind of a dark side of the American Revolution that is often overshadowed by the, kind of glory of it all. But to have over 18,000, was it? 18,000
Yes.
folks who died on those prison ships. It's pretty massive. It's a lot of.
Those weren't the killed in action. Those weren't the men killed in action. That
Yeah.
number. It's just the prisoners of war.
Yes, they turned to living skeletons. They died. They were starved. It was just awful, awful, awful long way to die. And anyone have any questions for Leslie?
Something in the chat?
Let's see, DJ says a very engaging presentation and great research.
Thank you, DJ.
There's a question from Sam. Can you tell us anything more about Daniel's widow after his death?
She lived a very long life, and I think she lived to 84, if I recall. I don't think she ever remarried. I did not see that anywhere in any of the genealogies. Daniel's children were rather young when he was taken, so the presentation was rather long already, so I didn't go into how much further. And there's a lot of wonderful stories from his children and grandchildren, and his great-grandson became a genealogist and a member of the Historical Association. And I think James Sullivan was the first president of the Massachusetts Historical Society, so quite a bit was written about the family because of that.
Yes. Yes, we do have a lot of materials on the Sullivan family.
I wonder, maybe Toby can give me some more insight into this. We have that the first let's see if I can get back to this, the first tombstone. I just from the dating of tombstones, that first monument, I wonder if that was Abigail's actual tombstone from when she passed. That would have been the style in the era that she passed.
Yes.
And so that they Daniel with hers is my speculation.
I think that is the story, that it was the stone was placed upon Abigail's death, and she, of course, she lived a very long time, as you said, and she was taken care of by the town very well. But so that stone was placed around after her death, or not long after.
1828.
1828, yes, and that one, of Of course, it broke down over the years and was replaced, let's say, oh, sometime, I think in the 1890s, I believe.
Mm.
It was replaced by this new stone, which is quite a nice monument down there in Sorrento.
Yeah.
Yeah. And we have
A sequel.
question. It's Kat wants to know, will there be a sequel or a continuation, part two?
Well, maybe I'll have to look into Civil War veterans from Sullivan and Sorrento next year for next winter.
Yes, we can always do more research. It's many, many lives to celebrate and honor in this 250 years from the
I
official
will
beginning.
say this actually, because I started this talk with the idea that I study refugees, that's my field, and that refugee rights come out of the rights for prisoners of war. And that actually happened in the Civil War. Um, Abraham Lincoln got this, he was a Prussian refugee who was the first political science, he's told, Francis Lieber. And he asked for orders on how the army should treat civilians. And it's called Special Order 100. And that is the basis for all right international law for refugees. The Geneva Convention is based on Francis Lieber's orders, Special Order 100 from the Civil War. So they do all connect to each other. So
Yeah, progression, yeah. American wars. Right. Does anyone else have any questions or comments for Dr. Leslie? All right. Well, this is, yes, next month. Yes, we will have History Hour next month. As a reminder, this program has been recorded and will be up on our YouTube channel for those that didn't catch the whole thing or weren't able to attend tonight. And next month, History Hour will be, I have to look at my calendar because it will be on April 14th, and I will be presenting on the history of the Singing Bridge, which is the centennial of its opening this year. So we'll be celebrating with an exhibit at the museum as well as a summer program. And many thanks from folks in the audience here. You've done a great job, Leslie. And we thank you so much for your wonderful program. And everyone, have a wonderful night. And we'll hopefully see you next month.
Thank you.